Welcome back. I hope that you had a fantastic weekend. We are discussing institution building, and this has us discussing the question of what constitutes a strong institution and what constitutes a weak institution. These are really fundamental questions because remember that much of our discussion of the theory of development focused on the role of institutions and whether countries were left with good institutions or bad institutions. Much of that discussion revolved around assumptions about the strength of institutions and how institutions function to either redistribute power or not redistribute power. Because remember that bad institutions strengthen the power of the elites, good institutions tend to disperse power. This discussion has us focusing on much more fundamental questions. What are strong institutions? What are weak institutions? And this is a conversation that we'll have together. What I plan on doing with you today is conceptualizing institutional strength and thinking about how to gauge and measure the strength of an institution, a formal rule, the rules of the game as we understand them. So, what I plan to do is walk you through this step by step and incorporate you by presenting you with some hypothetical examples and working with you to address some questions about what different components are in the different examples that I show you. We'll go through this piece by piece, and I want you to be patient and remain focused because this will be a meticulous and a careful discussion. But the goal is to give you a conceptual tool that will help you to better understand those theories of development and the role of institutions more generally. So, thank you for being here and welcome back. I have both good and bad news. The bad news is that institutions vary in their strength. Some are strong and some are weak. The good news is that we have tools available to us for gauging the strength or the weakness of those institutions, and specifically by thinking about what they accomplish and what they don't. So, without further ado, let's get started and get back into it. But before we take a look at the question of conceptualization, can someone just share with us, in their own words, what is your understanding of institutions? What are institutions? And what role do they play in development? Can someone just get us started by refreshing our memories?
Sure. An institution is kind of like a body figure, kind of like the backbone of a state or an actor that I would say lays out a plan in order for whether they're developed or not, but the institutions give them essentially like laws to follow uh, in policy, essentially.
So, institutions are kind of like the backbone, says Max. They're like the structure or the rules, the arrangements, the outline, the skeleton, if you will, that sort of is in place so that different actors can engage in exchange or interaction, transactions, be they political or economic. We know that economic institutions exist, like rules about banking or investment. We know that political institutions exist, like rules about the relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch, or rules about the distribution of power between different institutions of government. These are those humanly devised constraints, right? Those those features of the system that are kind of like the bones, the apparatus, right? Institutions are hard to describe. So I think the best way to do it is to think of it in a very descriptive way and think about what institutions do. They're different than actors, right? Actors are people. Organizations might also be institutions, but formal rules, those are like the rules of the game, the rules that the actors have to play by when they play the game. And so rules and institutions are analogous to the rules when you play baseball or softball or volleyball or whatever team sport you may be familiar with, or even whatever board game you may be familiar with. You're familiar loosely with the concept of rules that you must follow when playing that game. These are those institutions. And as Max says, institutions have a lot to do with development because they tend to create incentives or restrain or restrict or empower certain actors. And in doing so, they tend to create long-term patterns of growth or stagnation. And these patterns then tend to result in development or underdevelopment or the reversal of development, even in cases like Argentina. So Anieli says there are sets of rules. Absolutely, norms that establish a state and influence the people. So as Anieli points out, these can be formal or informal. They can be norms and social norms. They can also be formal rules, those legal codified rules that we write down, that we put in the Constitution, that we put in the books, that we sanction or sort of codify, right? It's that promulgation of a formal rule. In this discussion, we're going to focus primarily on formal rules, those ones that are promulgated and written down and codified, put in the Constitution or put in, some living record that we all have to obey or live under in a given community. Now, we know that formal rules interact with social norms, and those social norms can be quite complex. We'll layer those on top a little bit later, but for now, we're going to begin with the formal rules. Lewis says, aren't institutions like a bank or a branch of government? There are many different forms of institutions like political institutions. So it is true that formal organizations like financial institutions or banks, those are institutions as well, in the sense that they are permanent features of the environment that have a formal sanction. They're sanctioned or codified by the state. We know that bureaucratic institutions of the state or institutions of government, those are organizations in the same way. They are also institutions. Those are institutions, certainly, in the sense that they have formal roles and responsibilities and formal legal identities, and they are codified in law or they are sanctioned by the state. In this discussion, we're going to focus primarily on those rules that organizations themselves have to play by. So even though formal organizations like Congress or the executive branch are also institutions, we're going to focus on those institutions and those rules of the game that those organizations themselves have to obey. So the rules that rule the rulers, in other words, like the rules about the distribution of power or what institutions can or cannot do, etc. These are questions about the rules of the game that the actors in the game have to play by, even if the actors themselves can be thought of as formal institutions as well, like, say, the legislature or the judiciary. So Landra says, institutions are sectors of government, work, education, et cetera, that affect policies and everyday life of citizens. So those are sectors. Sectors, though, might have more in common with structures, right? The structures of the economy in the sort of outline or the shape of the economy. It's true that there are formal institutions that govern education and govern the different sectors, but those are the rules of the game. And those rules of the game might be slightly different than those sectors themselves. Now, so I'm trying to draw a distinction between, say, the actors and the individuals and the groups who may be formally organized, and then those formal rules that those individual actors and groups that make up the structure of the economy and the sectors have to play by. So these are those formal rules of the game, the rules that govern the rulers or the rules that govern the actors. So as long as we're then on sort of a similar page here, let's begin to talk about what makes an institution strong or what strong institutions do. If we're talking about formal rules, say the mining regulations that companies have to follow, the practices that they have to avoid, in the practices that they have to follow. If we're talking about the rules about what kinds of financial derivatives banks can sell and what kinds they can't. If we're talking about the rules regarding what the executive branch of the government can do and what it cannot. If we're talking about the rules regarding what the judiciary can do and what it cannot, these are formal rules of the game. These are the rules that govern the rulers or the rules that govern the actors. And what we can say is that those rules of the game that are strong are rules that redistribute and restrain power, authority, or expectations in order to produce an institutional outcome that diverges from what the pre-institutional outcome would have been. So let me unpack that and explain what that is saying. What we're saying is that institutions are rules that we lay down and that then change the outcome and change the environment in a way that leads to a different outcome than would have occurred in the absence of that institution. The institution is a rule that changes the behavior of the actors. It alters the behavior of the actors in a way that alters the outcomes in the environment. It produces an institutional outcome, a change in the environment by changing the behavior of the actors through a redistribution of power or authority or a change in the expectations of the individual actors. These are rules, the rules of the game, the rules that govern the actors or the rulers themselves. So let's take this piece by piece and walk through it. Before we lay down that institution, before we create that rule of the game, we have the environment that is absent that institution. This is sort of like the state of nature. It's not really accurate to call it that, but this is sort of what we mean. This is like time zero before we create the institution. But once we create the institution, the environment changes and the behavior of the actors or the expectations of the actors change. And then the environment as a result is changed. This is a theoretical description of the role of a strong institution. So in the state of nature, we have this situation where before we create the institution, the environment is pre-institutional. We impose the institution and the institution changes the environment and produces a different outcome than would have obtained had the institution not been created. This is the essence of an institution. The actors can't leave. They can't leave the system. The institution has been created. They now have to change their behavior or alter their expectations in response to the institution. Now, the question of the institution's strength comes down to what degree the actors actually change their behavior and to what degree the institution actually produces the expected outcome. Now, what you should be noticing is that there can be a gap between what the institution is supposed to accomplish or what outcome it's supposed to produce and the outcome that it actually produces. Think about it. Whenever we create a rule, we always intend to change the behavior of someone or something or change their expectations. Our objective is to produce some change. Now, in reality, the outcome might fall short of our expectations or our intentions. But the institution can still have an important effect if it achieves all or most of its intended outcome. That is to say, if for the most part, it changes behavior, it changes expectations, it brings behavior and expectations more in line with our stated objective. And what we would refer to as the strength of the institution is essentially the difference between the pre-institutional outcome and the institutional outcome itself. A strong institution is one that achieves all or most of its intended outcome. This represents the intended outcome. This here with this apostrophe. What you're seeing here is an institutional outcome that represents most of the objective that motivated the original institutional creation, because most of the intended outcome is achieved. This is the overall strength of the institution. A strong institution is one that achieves all or most of what its intended outcome is. Now, this is the intended outcome. When we create the institution or the rule, we expect or we intend for it to produce some change in the behavior of the actors or produce some change in their expectations. And a strong institution is one that, for the most part, accomplishes that. Now, if we instead drew the line here and the institutional outcome fell far, far short of the intended outcome, we couldn't call that a strong institution. It would be a relatively weak institution because it would not be accomplishing most of what we intended it to accomplish. Instead, it would be falling short by a long shot. We would call that a weak institution. So, if in the case of mining regulations, most of the regulations are being ignored and most of the requirements are not being met, that would be a weak institution. But if most of the intended behaviors are being observed, we would call that a stronger institution. It's always going to be relative. It has to be to do with the proportion of the intended outcome that is actually brought about. How much work is the institution actually doing as a formal rule of the game that must be followed by the actors? And so we then can figure out the strength of the institution, or what we would call institutional strength, by simply determining the gap between the pre-institutional outcome and the actual institutional outcome as a proportion of the intended outcome or the intended behavioral change or the intended change in expectations. In this regard, we're thinking about institutional strength in relative terms. It's not absolute. Absolute would require that all of the intended outcome be achieved, that all of the intended change in behavior or expectations be observed. But a relative approach is different because it only examines the proportion of the overall goal that is achieved. And in this way, we have a different and a more sort of forgiving approach to institutional strength. And you'll see later why we do that, why we consider institutional strength in relative as opposed to absolute terms. Now, let's take a few examples and let's start to think about how we would conceptualize a strong institution in a number of different policy areas using these notions and these ideas in these concepts and these categories that I've given you so far. What we're going to do is I'm going to walk you through some examples where I show you the answers for two examples and I explain the reasoning. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a third example. And I'm going to ask you to use these concepts and these ideas to answer that third example or that third question. So let's start with the example of taxes. Taxes are a very common institution. In fact, we tend to take it for granted because we forget that it's a humanly devised constraint, a rule that was created in a human community so that everyone in that community would change their behavior and obey and change their expectations. Let's talk about how a strong tax regime would work or what that might look like, hypothetically speaking. So the first question for us, if we're thinking about this hypothetically, is what is the pre-institutional outcome? In that state of nature or in that situation prior to the creation of taxes, what is the pre-institutional outcome? Well, the pre-institutional outcome has to be that individuals in society give no share of their income to the state. That has to be the pre-institutional outcome. Because before there were taxes, those individuals did not give a share of their income to the state because of the existence of some rule. Instead, that more often relied on coercive power or other kinds of relationships or other sorts of things. And so, what we can say first and foremost is that in the pre institutional outcome, individuals don't give any share of their income to the state. At least they don't do so because of some rule that says that they have to do so. They may be doing so for other reasons, but they're not doing so because of the existence of a rule that says that they have to do so. Okay, so that's our pre-institutional outcome. Fair enough. Well, Radia, policy is an institution. So when we talk about institutional analysis, we're talking about policy analysis. Policies are rules or practices or bundles or sets of practices that establish some norm or some approach or some practice. So I don't think that the distinction between an institution and a policy amounts to a difference. I think that that might just be a small distinction. Taxes are an institution. Tax regimes, those are rules regarding what people can and cannot do with their income. And so taxes imply that they've got to give a share of their income to the state. But a policy is an institution, generally speaking. That's why policy analysis is also called institutional analysis. And I know this because I was trained in political economy and I was trained in policy analysis. So this is our pre-institutional outcome. Individuals give no share of their income to the state. At least they don't give any share of their income to the state because there's a rule that says that they have to. Now, our next question is, well, what is the intended outcome? If we are creating a tax regime or a tax policy for the purpose of changing behavior or expectations, what outcome do we intend to produce? Well, we intend to produce an outcome where, say, individuals give a certain share of their income to the state. Let's say, for hypothetical purposes and for simplification's sake, that it's a flat tax that is 25% of their income. Okay. For hypothetical simplification's sake, let's say that everyone in society, individuals, firms, everyone, gives 25% of their income to the state. Okay, so this is our intended outcome. We're creating a flat tax that everyone must obey. Okay, so now we have the pre institutional outcome and we have the intended outcome. And the strength of the institution of taxes or our tax regime is going to depend on what proportion of our intended outcome is actually achieved through the creation, design, and implementation of our tax regime or our tax code or our tax policy. And so let's say for hypothetical purposes, our actual institutional outcome is when all is said and done, individuals wind up giving 22% of their income to the state. Now, this is the actual outcome. This is the result. This is the environment. This is what we observe in the actual political economy after the creation and imposition of the institution, in this case, the tax policy that we settled on, the 25% tax policy, our flat tax that we imposed on individuals, firms, and all private actors. So what we would then have is a relatively strong institution, right? It's not perfect. It's not the case that there's total compliance, but for the most part, there's a relatively high level of compliance. Individuals on the whole, when all is said and done, gave 22% of their income to the state. That's a relatively high level of compliance with the institution, with the rule. Now, you may be wondering, well, why isn't it perfect compliance? Well, good question. That probably has to do with the rest of the story, right? The power relations, the differences between individuals in society. Some actors, some individuals, some firms may be more capable than others at using deceptive tricks to hide income or not pay their taxes, or use loopholes that permit them to avoid complying with the spirit of the law, and so on and so forth. That's the rest of the story, right? That's the rest of what happens in the political economy. The institutions don't explain everything. If the institutions were everything, we could reduce everything to just the rules of the game. But we can't, because there is a lot else that goes on. And when you begin to consider the gap between the intended outcome and the actual outcome, it becomes interesting to think about why there's any deviation. And in my opinion, and what I'm inclined to suggest, is that power relations and power asymmetries and differences from actor to actor in society help to explain a lot of that deviation, that difference between the intended outcome and the institutional outcome. Now, this is the example of taxes, but we could also give the example of, say, mining regulations and compliance with mining rules or laws about what practices mining companies or natural resource producers have to comply with. And we could do that example. We could say that in the pre institutional environment, mining companies do not make any changes to their practices, and their practices pollute the environment. In this pre institutional environment, we suffer from the consequences of pollution, and there's a need for us to create rules or regulations that will constrain these mining and natural resource producers. They're polluting streams, they're polluting the air. we've got to create rules or regulations that will tighten tighten up those practices and help to ensure safer drinking water and so on and so forth. You can easily see the need for society to respond to pollution in this way. So we've got our pre-institutional outcome. Our intended outcome is going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of inducing firms to avoid specific practices and complying with others. We could identify a whole range of specific practices, maybe fracking or the way in which waste is discarded or disposed of. We can create certain rules of compliance regarding maybe the maximum amount of waste that can be held at a given time by a company so as to avoid the possibility of spills, for example, and so on and so forth. We can think about a whole number of different rules that we might impose. But as before, the institutional outcome in the gap between the intended outcome and the actual outcome will determine the strength of the institution. And so if we are imagining a strong institution, well, then we need to find that in practice, firms are avoiding most forbidden practices and they're complying with most required practices. If we discover in practice, however, that most forbidden practices are not being avoided and that most required practices are not being complied with, then we would conclude that that is not a strong institution. It's a weak institution. So, in any given policy area or in any given issue area, you can imagine a strong or a weak institution based upon how much work that institution is doing, how effectively it is changing behavior and expectations, and really more generally, the gap between the intended outcome and the actual institutional outcome, and how far that institutional outcome is from the pre-institutional environment, that state of nature that preceded the creation of the institution in response to whatever practice or activity was determined to be undesirable and that needed to be responded to with the creation of a rule. So I've given you now two examples. We've talked about taxes, we've talked about mining regulations. Let's talk about and address the example of property rights. And property rights are another classic institution or set of rules or set of policies that relate closely to political economy of development. And property rights might be the most fundamental of economic institutions precisely because of how fundamental they are to investment and growth and in competitive relationships in the economy. We're going to begin this by watching a video that just helps to describe what property rights are. I don't want to insult anyone's intelligence, so we'll begin by just describing and sort of exploring this concept from the perspective of what a property rights regime is or what a property right is as an institution or as a rule. So we'll do this by looking at John Locke and the ideas of John Locke. This is relatively close to the description that we'll use, but it's above all just a useful introduction to property rights as we'll discuss them.
Welcome to the Essential Ideas of John Locke. One of Locke's most important and enduring insights related to property. Locke argued that every person was born with certain basic natural rights, and that these natural rights enabled individuals to acquire further rights, including property rights. Locke argued that, first and foremost, every person has a property right over themselves. In other words, each person has a right of self-ownership, meaning others, such as a king, do not have control over the individual person. This view stood in stark contrast to the view that the king or queen owned everything, including the people, or that the rights of individuals were determined by the will of the sovereign. Locke argued that such sovereign authority over the individual was contrary to the law of nature. The bundle of rights that Locke envisioned every person possessing also included the right to one's labor. This means that individuals have a right to the fruits of their physical labor, as well as their ingenuity, creativity, and innovation. Locke also explained how we can come to have property rights in land or other natural resources, rights not based in political decree or favoritism. The key for Locke was what he called labor mixing, which occurs when a person uses their physical labor, ideas, imagination, and creativity to transform previously unused physical material. For example, Joe and Sarah arrive in the New World and find an unclaimed area of land. They begin a process of transforming the land to build a farm. According to Locke, this labor is how Joe and Sarah acquire rights over the land. Property rights over the products produced on the farm is an important addition because it means that Joe and Sarah have the right to decide how best to use their crop. They can consume it or trade it with people for other goods and services they might need. These insights about the importance of property rights in ensuring a free and prosperous society are as applicable now as they were when John Locke was writing them originally. For more information on John Locke, visit Ascent.
So there's a lot there, but what I want you to focus on is the idea that property rights relate to rules that say the state can't control what you own, and that you can own private property and accumulate private property free from the interference of the state or the expropriation of the state. You, in that regard, enjoy the right to dispose of or transfer or save or do whatever you want with your property. And property rights then become an important part of the economy and an important part of individual liberty. As an institution, though, property rights can be thought of in the same way that we've been thinking about institutions. Property rights is essentially a regime or a set of rules about what individuals can and can't do and what the state can and cannot do. And so far, I've given you a set of tools for thinking about strong and weak institutions. And so let's work through this together. And I want to ask you what the different parts of this example would be. So, in other words, what would the pre-institutional outcome be? What would the institutional outcome be? And what would the intended outcome be for a strong property rights regime? Let's use the chat to do this. Send me your responses, and I'm going to engage with you as much as possible so that we can work through this together and get to the bottom of it and use the approach. Good, Lewis. And Lewis, I want to ask you, who does have the power in that situation? Keep it coming, everybody. I want to engage with you as much as possible. At this stage, it's useful for us to use the chat so that I can interact with you and work with you. This is a point in the lecture where you will get the most if you engage with this and make an effort. Even if this seems challenging or new, please engage. Good, Lewis. That's exactly right. Good, Max. And Max, there's a little bit more there, and I'm going to send you a chat message to engage with you a little bit. That's good, Anna. That's good. The only thing, Anna, is I would I would wonder and I would think about, how do we know that when we see it? What are the indications of that, or what should we observe? But you're right, and I think that you're on off to a good start. Good, Anna. That's right. And to take it further, you'd want to determine how much that policy is being enforced, right? And to what degree it's being complied with. And then that's the question about the institutional strength. But you're exactly right. So as we continue doing this, everyone, I just kind of want to begin to discuss this with you a little bit. This is such a useful exercise because it forces us to think about categories, and it forces us to think about relationships and how they change once we create institutions. And so here in PO, this is the pre-institutional outcome, right? This is sort of our state of nature. I've been asking you all a number of questions as I engage with you. I've been asking, for example, who has the power in this pre-institutional outcome phase? Who is it who benefits at this moment? And the answer, as many of you have pointed out, is the state. When property rights don't exist, when we don't have a rule that protects property rights, the state can take your property, just like the video said. The king and the queen can take everything that you own or everything that is within your reach. Your farm, your product, whatever it is that you put to productive use and that you accumulated, they can take because there is no rule that protects your private property. The state then benefits from the situation in this scenario. Now, our intended outcome when we create a property rights regime is to protect the assets that individuals own, protect their ownership of their accumulated assets. So we might say that our intended outcome is to protect all of the assets that are accumulated and owned by private individuals. Okay, that's our intended outcome. Our institutional outcome, if it's a strong property rights regime, would be something like most assets owned by private individuals are protected. Most assets owned by private individuals are kept under their control and not expropriated by the state and not taken control of by the state. In this way, you can think of the very simple change that occurs when you impose that institution of property rights. And you can think about what a strong institution would do or what it would accomplish if you begin with the objective of protecting property rights. And so, property rights, individuals can own private property. This is what we mean. Our question: what is the pre institutional outcome? That institutional outcome is the king, the queen, the state can take control of whatever they want and do. They can seize or appropriate or expropriate or annex whatever it is that they would like, regardless of who it is or how they came about it or whatever. The plausible intended outcome would be the protection of the ownership of individual assets by private individuals. And a plausible institutional outcome could be, the protection of the ownership of most assets, right? Generally speaking, we'll say 75% or 80% or 85 or 90%, some share that is a relatively large proportion of the total. And in this way, we can conceive of institutional strength in the case of property rights in terms of the proportion of individual assets whose ownership is protected as a result of or under the new institutional status quo. Now, this is just an example, everyone, and we're still operating at a very, very abstract level. And I realize that many of us probably have questions. We'll deal with those on Monday. For now, we are out of time. Thank you very much for engaging with me. I know that this is probably quite challenging and maybe uncomfortable, but you did a really, really good job. And I hope that you'll be as engaged on Wednesday. So have a good day and a good afternoon, and I'll see you in a couple days.